Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our exhibition tour of our current exhibition, or one of our current exhibitions, Multiple Voices, Multiple Stories. I'm Dr. Gisela Carbonell. I am the curator here at the Cornell Fine Arts Museum, and I'm delighted to walk through this exhibition with you virtually this morning. So let me get my images ready. And I will be taking comments and questions. So if you have any questions or if you have any comments, feel free to add them in the comment box, and we will have a conversation as we go. So today I want to talk with you about this exhibition that opened earlier this summer and will be on view until August 29th. Like I said, is an exhibition that is from our permanent collection titled Multiple Voices, Multiple Stories, and that title reflects the objectives and the goals of this exhibition. This exhibition is installed across 2 galleries in our museum, and it includes 34 works from our permanent collection by more than 30 artists, and the works range from the 15th century to the 21st century. So it's an exhibition that shows artwork across time periods and also across regions and across backgrounds. It's an exhibition that includes a diverse roster of artists. And when I say diverse, I'm talking about different time periods, different ethnic backgrounds, different perspectives, different media, and different approaches to art making. And of course, because of the timeline covered in the exhibition, we're going to be looking at artists who worked in different traditions, right? From 15th, 19th century to contemporary artists who work with traditional media in different ways and in very innovative ways of presenting their ideas and their works. And so one of the things that I want to highlight as we go through, and I'm showing you here an image on the right of the entrance to the exhibition with our title wall there. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that work on the right by Jordan Castille in a second. And then here on the left, a view of that first gallery. Once you walk towards the back of that title wall, you see the gallery in the image on the left. So one of the things that I want to highlight as we start talking about the exhibition and consider the spaces that we're going to navigate together this morning is, as I said, the exhibition is displayed in 2 galleries, and I'm showing you here a dollhouse view of the galleries, and this is a capture of the 360 virtual tour of the exhibition that is available on our website, on our exhibition page. So if you visit us at rollins.edu/CFAM, you can view the exhibition page, read a little bit about the show, and then at the bottom there's a link that will take you to this virtual tour that you can manipulate on your computer or on your device to see the exhibition, the different angles. You can zoom in and look at the works more closely and have a sense for how the exhibition is organized and how each work is presented and how the works relate to each other. And that's an important point for me to share with you this morning about this show from a curatorial perspective, and I can share a little bit of the behind the scenes or background of how we put this exhibition together. In this exhibition in particular, the placement of the works of art was very important. The placement of groups of works, but also of individual works that are activated, their meaning is activated depending on what you're looking at, depending on what other works you are viewing and considering as you move through the galleries. So this was a project that started in 2019, and I want to acknowledge and thank Morgan Snope, who used to be our curatorial fellow here at the museum, and she's a Rollins alumna now doing her doctoral studies in Boston, and she helped me and worked closely with me in the early stages of this exhibition. And so the placement of the works in the show is important because the works range in time period and region and medium and background. It is important to consider them as individual works, but one of the things that the exhibition encourages viewers to do is to think about the dialogues, the conversations that are happening in those juxtapositions, that in those contrasts, there are ideas and concepts that are being examined, questioned, and that are invitations for the viewers to reflect on and to think about perhaps from a different perspective. So it's an exhibition that includes a lot of figurative work. So the driving force of this show was the concept of portraiture. And I wanted to examine the collection and make a selection to explore figurative works. And if you want to share with me, what do you think about when you hear the word portrait? When you go into a museum and you think about portraits or you see portraits, what is usually represented and how is that representation, how has that representation been consistent across centuries? Probably a lot like the ones that we are seeing on the screen right now. In the tradition of portraiture, and these are 3 works that are included in our exhibition from our collection, traditionally we see, especially if we go back to the 16th, 17th, 18th century, we see kings and queens, we see members of the aristocracy, perhaps historical figures, deities that are represented in portraits. And those are the ones whose likeness is preserved for generations and their legacies are known because there was an artist who was commissioned to paint their portrait. So thinking about this concept and reflecting upon this idea that who else was there at that time, at that moment, in that place, who did not get to have a portrait painted or sculpted so people would get to know them and remember them, right? So, when you think about all the other people who didn't make it to the art history book or who didn't make it into the museum galleries, and those stories also are important, and also those voices are also relevant, and those stories need to be told, right? So with that concept, we started researching the collection and thinking about which works we could bring out that that could help us as visitors when we go to the museum engage in those conversations. And so the way that we display these works in the gallery help us to engage in those conversations and think about those questions without necessarily being an exhibition of equivalencies. It's not an exhibition that's saying, here's a portrait, here's how a woman was depicted in the 19th century, and here's how women are depicted today, or this is how women were depicted in such and such culture, and here's how a different culture represents women. That is not what the exhibition intends to do. These are just suggestions in terms of the proximity of how the works are displayed. Suggestions for the viewer to perhaps think about the differences and the similarities in some of these pieces across time and across place. So we talked a little bit, I mentioned this painting on the right when we started, which was in the main slide for the presentation, and is this painting by Jordan Castille, American painter, titled Shirley Spa Boutique to Go. And it's the work that is displayed right next to our title wall. So as visitors come into the museum, see this painting, it's a large painting, it's a large portrait. If I can go back here for a second, you can see it there on the right. It takes that whole wall. It's a beautiful, bright painting that very difficult not to notice it, right? And it was placed there right across from the painting that we see on the left by American painter Francis Alexander. Here's the portrait of Marianne Dove, an actress, and this one is from the 19th century. So when you walk into the exhibition, you see the painting by Jordan Castille on the right and the painting by Francis Alexander on your left. So that kind of frames the experience of walking into the gallery to view this exhibition. So Jordan Castille, young American artist, her process is fascinating in terms of how she selects who she depicts in her portraits and how she engages with her community. So she had a residency at the Studio Museum, and the time that she spent in Harlem, she decided to meet people in that neighborhood and engage with people in that community and learn who they are, what their stories are. And she would bring a camera and ask if she could photograph them. And she would say, you know, I want to take your picture. I'm an artist and I will paint your portrait. And this portrait will be in a museum at some point. And the stories are really interesting in terms of how some people reacted to her, this partnership and friendship that emerged while working with someone. And so that is the case here with Shirley that we see here on the right. And so in the series and as part of this project, Castille sets out to create this large scale, sometimes monumental portraits of everyday people. These are not aristocrats, they're not royalty, they're not politicians. These are regular people in the neighborhood where she spent time, people that she would encounter every day. And so one of the things that I find so fascinating, not only about her process, but fascinating about her work, is that these portraits emphasize a very deep sense of connection, not only between the artist and the person depicted, but also between the viewer and the person depicted, right? And that's one of the things that we were interested in exploring with this exhibition, is those different levels of engagement, that we're learning about the artist, but we're also learning about the subject depicted, but we're also learning about ourselves, right? And how we relate with those who are portrayed in some of these works of art. And so here we have Shirley in our galleries with this large scale portrait in her apartment with her table where she does her massages and facials and hair care and all of that. And so we're in her space and we're learning about her and her craft and her labor. And it's an everyday scene with the same dignity and the same importance and attention to detail as, for example, the portrait on the left painted by Alexander in the mid-19th century, a portrait of a theater actress here probably wearing a costume for one of her characters. And on the left, this portrait painted with the conventions of portraiture at that time, right? The very neutral background. We see the curtain, a piece of the curtain there on the left corner. The subject is seated very elegantly, looking out directly at the viewer and engaging us and making us part of that exchange. And so it's interesting how Castille is kind of playing with those art historical conventions in the tradition of portraiture, but kind of pushing it a little bit further to acknowledge those who we traditionally don't see depicted in large scale important paintings in museums and galleries when we go to museums. And so we're very happy to have this work as part of the Alpha collection of contemporary art, greeting us as we walk into multiple voices, multiple stories. And so here you see a view from a different angle of that same gallery, and you see that we have included sculpture as well as paintings. And some of the works that are included in this section of the exhibition are works that speak to very personal relationships between artists and sitters. We have, for instance, one of the paintings in this gallery by Tibor Pataki, a Hungarian-American artist who depicts here his wife who poses for this painting. And then there are others by Alice Neal, for instance, and David Hockney, where they depict friends, people who were important in their lives. And then we have other artists who take a more global approach to the representation of the figure. We're going to take a look at some examples. So I mentioned Tibor Pataki, who we see here on the right, this allegorical portrait of Ellen Pataki from 1931, where there are elements of his own, of the artist's own cultural background and history as an immigrant and then coming to Florida, and his wife posing here with this beautiful dress that kind of evokes the landscape, including all those elements in the painting. And we place that in close proximity to the sculpture that appears in the center of the gallery by Yinka Shonibari, Athena after Myron. This is a sculpture from 2019 that evokes the pose of the sculpture of Athena by Myron from ancient times. And then the head of the sculpture is not representing any one particular deity or person, but in this case, it's a globe. And so Shonibari in this work talks about, as he does in a lot of his works, talks about issues having to do with the history of colonialism and imperialism, and in this case, using the Dutch wax print fabric patterns that we see in the garment that the figure is wearing, that has implications in the history of this type of fabric and colonialism and the trade between Europe and Africa. And Yinka Shonibari is of Nigerian descent. He lives and works in Britain, and a lot of his work plays with the history of art, how these figures are presented, how is the discourse of Western European art has been constructed and taught for generations, right? And so the formal qualities here are very interesting. The dress that Ellen Pataki is wearing in this portrait resonates very interestingly and perhaps complements the textile pattern that Shonibari is using for his sculpture. But beyond the formal elements that kind of seem to be in dialogue and speak to each other, I like the pairing because it's a good example of how a work of art, speaking about the Pataki painting on the right, can speak to a very personal experience. And another work of art, the one on the left by Shonibari, also speaks about a personal experience, but it's more a statement or an exploration about global issues, about historical issues, in this case, as I said, colonialism, labor, so many different things that are part of that conversation. And here's another interesting juxtaposition also in this gallery. On the right, we have this lithograph by David Hockney. This is Joe with Green Window from 1979. Next to this image by Peggy Bacon, The Lamentable Lunch from 1952, which is a very small work and one that I really enjoy thinking about and looking at, not only because of the title, but the way that the figure is represented here. So here again, we have a contrast of styles and approaches, and also in terms of who is represented in these works. In the case of David Hockney, British artist, of course, who is very well known for his beautiful paintings and also digital paintings and drawings that he has done more recently. Hockney here represents his friend Joe. And if you look at the face of this figure, he has a very intense expression. He's turning to us, but he doesn't necessarily looks at the viewer directly. And there's an interesting story that goes with this work. Hockney in an interview talks about how Joe was the first person he knew to have HIV, and he was the first friend, his first friend to pass away. So those experiences that the artist had, and the memory of this friend and what he meant in his life, but also the place that he has in his memory and heart as the first friend that he had who passed, and the first friend that he knew of to have HIV, were very important for the artist. And so he wanted to represent his friend Joe here, and kind of commemorate him as someone important in his life. And so you can see that intensity in the expression. It's a very a simple way in which he is depicted, and yet he has that kind of profound gesture and expression in his face. And then on the left, and we place them not next to each other, but in the same gallery in close proximity. On the left, we have this image by Peggy Bacon, and we don't know who the man depicted is. So here's another take on portraiture or figurative work, where the Hockney is a very personal image to the artist, this portrait of Joe. In the case of Peggy Bacon, it's a more satirical take on a middle-aged or older man who is alone in a cafeteria or a cafe, having his sandwich and his coffee and looking very sad, right? So, you know, some of Peggy Bacon's works have these kind of satirical undertone where she's looking at the world around her and sort of with humor, but also representing those people who may not otherwise have a portrait done, or may not otherwise be even seen or noticed, right? And so it's interesting here that this man could be everyone, anyone, right? It could be anyone we see in a restaurant or in a coffee shop. It could be ourselves. It could be anyone. We can all see ourselves in a representation like this one, right? At some point or another, we all have been alone in a cafe or in a restaurant, having lunch, being sad, maybe having a bad day, right? And just being in that moment with your circumstances and your thoughts. And not much else, right? And so I think it's interesting here that Bacon is creating a work of a scene from everyday life, a common activity by a common everyday person. And so it can be personal in that sense, but there's a universality also to this kind of representation that may resonate with us in a different way. Right. And so I think these are examples of how this exhibition sort of tries to tease out some of those layers, right, of the multiple voices that can be contained in a work of art when we really unpack it and think about it and sit with it and look at it. There's more than just what we see on the surface. And there's more that we can relate to than what we see on the surface, if we so choose to engage with that part of the work. Then we go into the adjacent gallery, which is a little bit bigger, and we have the rest of the exhibition is displayed in this large gallery. And again, we have a few sculptures, we have a digital piece, we have paintings and prints in this gallery. And there are several themes that are that run across that kind of work as connecting threads throughout the exhibition, you know, this idea of the stories of different perspectives and voices. And then there are themes that we see throughout the show, like some of the ones that we just talked about in relation to personal connections, universality, global historical issues. And so if you go into the gallery and you want to navigate the exhibition with those themes in mind, there are QR codes that you can scan in the gallery. And there are 5 themes where you will get a narration and of those themes, so you can think about them, and there are suggestions in terms of works of art that speak to those specific themes as you walk through the show. And of course, each piece of work, each piece of art here has a label with extended text that you can read and learn more about the artist and about the work. Another interesting juxtaposition in the exhibition is the pairing of the sculpture here on the right by Iram Powers and this portrait on the back wall that you see here, which is a photograph by artist Sean Theodore, and it's a portrait of the poet Amanda Gorman. That one is from 2018, and then the marble sculpture on the right by Iram Powers is from 1867, and it's an allegorical portrait. It's titled Faith. And so when you walk into the gallery and you look to the right, you'll see the portrait of Amanda Gorman on the back, this portrait, bust portrait in marble, kind of in the foreground, that represents a female, a very traditional European female ideal of beauty, right? It's the very conventional way of representing European female figures, deities or otherwise, in this type of sculpture in this period, mid to late 19th century, of course. And then when we look at the portrait of Amanda Gorman, I'm wondering if I have pictures here up close that you can see. So Amanda Gorman, of course, more recently, we know her from her presentation in the 46th presidential inauguration. In January, she performed or read her poem, The Hill We Climb, and was on the cover of several magazines and has done a lot of interviews to talk about her poem and how she was selected to be the Youth Poet Laureate. And this photograph was captured before that. It was from 2018. The artist met the poet in Los Angeles at an award ceremony. And they started a friendship with the group of people that they were together at that event. And the artist asked her if he could photograph her the next day. And so he did a photo shoot with her and took several images of her. And we were fortunate to be able to acquire this one for our collection earlier this year. And so here we see the poet in profile, and we see her very prominent hair, the diagonal of her dress, the contrast between white and black in the photograph, and really focusing in on this profile and the significance of this figure for our youth. So we thought it's a great example, and it's a great figure to have represented in our collection, especially being a college art museum, to have her featured, her image featured in our gallery. And so this juxtaposition of the portrait of the poet here in close proximity to the sculpture representing faith, perhaps will encourage reflection on ideals of beauty, on ideals of perfection, you know, all these things that are contained in that bust sculpture that date back to ancient times, particularly to classical Greece, right? And so Gorman, as perhaps a spokesperson for the youth of our time, she has talked about her activism and her work as a nationally recognized figure now. And she has also talked in interviews about overcoming obstacles like difficulty pronouncing certain letters, difficulty with hearing, how overcoming a speech impediment when she does spoken word and recites poetry in public. And so she's really a role model for persistence and overcoming and resiliency. And so all qualities that are beautiful, perhaps in a different way than what the sculpture here is emphasizing as beauty. And then we see here that same gallery. You can see the portrait of Gorman here in the background, and then the marble bust sculpture here on the right. In the center of this gallery, we have a larger sculpture. We have other works on the back wall. We have photography and pieces by other artists. But I want to talk a little bit about the sculpture here in the center. And you see it propped up in that platform. And this is a sculpture by artist Daniel Ramos. This one is called Victorious, 1797. And it is propped up on that platform. And there's not one right way to look at it. So it's in the round, so you can walk around it and view it from different angles and different perspectives, because you will see something different from each angle. And so this sculpture, it's a sort of equestrian statue. If you notice, it is propped up high on that platform, and it evokes the traditional equestrian statues that we see in public spaces and in some museums. And usually who we see in those equestrian statues or portraits are military generals, figures from history. I can think of Napoleon, I can think of others. And here, what Daniel Ramos is doing is sort of subverting that. Again, is looking at, and this one is from 2018, 2019, is looking at the history of representation of these figures. And in this particular case, it's a work that alludes to the victory over the British, when the British in 1797 approached the island of Puerto Rico with the intention of invading it and seizing it from the Spanish. And the Spanish were not prepared for this attack, and so Black militias in the northern coast of the island were able to organize and avoid this attack on the island of Puerto Rico. And so these people on the northern coast of the island who organized and repelled the invasion were able to defend their land, right, against this foreign navy that was invading in 1797. And so here, Daniel Ramos looks at that history, and with objects that he creates with materials collected from one of those towns, Loíza, where he is from and where he lives, which was a very important location in this history of this attempted invasion in 1797, and uses, some are found materials, others are constructed with materials from that area, from coconuts and branches to pieces of furniture, to everyday banal objects that he collects. And he has created this figure which evokes the equestrian portraits, equestrian statues from centuries past of colonizers and important generals and political figures. And so here is a statue that celebrates regular people who were able to organize and defend their territory, and who were able to confront an enemy that was much better prepared and better armed than they were, and yet they were able to avoid what they intended to do. And so the sculpture is rich in materials that create interesting contrasts. You know, we see fabrics, we see, as I said, coconuts and branches and parts of palm trees, with textiles that have sequins and thumbtacks, shoes, different types of materials that all have important meaning and significance within the history of colonialism in the Caribbean, and in particular within in the history of the island of Puerto Rico in this case. The image on the left here is a painting by the British artist George Romney. This is the portrait of an English naval officer from 1780. And if you look at the image on the right, you'll see the portrait in the background in that wall that's a little bit darker, right across from Ramos' sculpture. And so this was a very intentional decision, of course, on our part to install the painting by Romney there, because even though we don't know the name of this specific naval officer, and even though we don't know if this specific individual was involved in that mission that in the Caribbean in 1797, but we do know it's a portrait from 1780, so very close in the timeline. And this type of portrait usually celebrated the achievements and the accomplishments of high-ranking officers in the military and important figures who had a history of achievements, had their portrait done, and their legacy kind of preserved for future generations, right? And so the placement of these two works in dialogue here, again, is an invitation to think about one historical event, but perhaps seen through two very different lenses, seen through or approached from very different perspectives, right? From the perspective of those who colonized or attempted to colonize places in the Caribbean, and then from the perspective of those who were in the island and had to confront the reality of this event in 1797. And of course, they both speak to two very different traditions of art making. In the case of Ramos, a very contemporary approach to use found materials, to reclaim organic materials, and construct this sculpture in a process that perhaps involves an engagement with location, with circumstances, at the same time as with history and historical events. The painting by Romney here, of course, a much more traditional approach to portrait painting in the European tradition. And here's a close-up image of some of the elements of the sculpture that you can see a little bit better. And again, it's like the other works in the exhibition, is one that I encourage you to come see in person and take a little bit of time exploring it and looking at the different elements and how the artist has constructed each of the elements that compound this piece. And here's another view of the sculpture with the naval officer in the background. And here's another view of another section of the exhibition here, where we have three works on this wall, and I'm going to talk a little bit about two of them. Again, this idea of the pairing or the contrast between works to encourage those dialogues. So the works in the image on the right, we have a portrait of a woman by German artist Kathy Kollwitz. And then in the center here, we have Francisco Zúñiga's La Comida, and on the right, Luis Sabiko's General Santa Ana. So I want to focus on these two before we go today. So here on the left, we have a portrait painting of a general and a politician, Antonio López de Santa Anna. This one is from 1876 by a Mexican artist, Luis Sabiko. We don't know a lot about this artist. There's not a ton of research available about the artist or his practice, but we do know that he made portraits of important military and political figures in Mexico in the 19th century. And then on the right here, we have a beautiful image by Francisco Zúñiga, who was, of course, born in Costa Rica, but Mexican sculptor and painter. And here we have this scene titled La Comida, or supper. And here we have a family sitting at the table. We see the couple and the young child sitting at the table with a very simple interior setting and very minimal in terms of the resources that they have. Very modest and humble. These are more likely workers, laborers here that are taking a moment to have supper. And this one is from 1980. And I like the juxtaposition of these two because as with the pairing of the Daniel Lin Ramos sculpture and the portrait of the British naval officer, here we have two depictions from two very different time periods, right? Almost 100 years apart. And the portrait of General Santa Anna is believed to be a posthumous one. It has these clouds around him that probably were signal that it was a painting done after his death in remembrance of this political figure who was very controversial at the time, and very interesting story. But we see him here with his medals, military garb, and in his best light, right? And he's portrayed as a young, strong man. Doesn't necessarily mean that he looked like that at the time of his passing, but this is the way in which he wanted to be remembered. And so this is the way in which the artist depicted him. In contrast, on the right, we don't know the names of those who are seated at the table here. Like we don't know the names and the stories of so many people who are overlooked in history, right? And so that this pairing sort of speaks to that contrast and wonder. It makes us wonder about what are the stories of these people who are seated at the table. We know a lot about General Santa Anna. We know a lot of details about his policies and his controversial decisions that he made as a politician and as a military man. But we don't know much about those seated at the table in Zúñiga's work, just like we don't know the stories of so many people like those represented here. And so those voices are kind of, they exist. And so, of course, we want to try to bring them to light, or at least bring awareness of how a lot of these stories are overlooked and lost across time. And so there are other interesting pairings in the exhibition. Here we have Sondergaard with these three intriguing images, and Deborah Cass, and others that you can explore when you come to the museum to see the exhibition. Here we have a small sculpture bust by Elizabeth Catlett, and other views of the gallery here. And another one here. And so this is an exhibition that I hope will open up important dialogues and opportunities for reflection when you come to the gallery. And it's an exhibition about opportunity to enjoy and to delight in the skillful and beautiful artwork that is presented, but also to think about how and why and when these works were created. What was the intention of the artist when they created it? What was the framework in which they were working during their time that kind of informs their perspective? And how do we, from our current standpoint, can analyze and think about these images and these works from our current perspective, with our current sense of history, from our current moment. So I hope that you've enjoyed this tour today. I know that it's not the same as being in the gallery together, which we will do very soon. But if you have any questions or comments, I'm happy to address them if you have any. And in the meantime, just wanted to remind you that you can visit our website, rollins.edu/CFAM. And of course, you can come see the show, which will be on view until August 29th. So thank you, Kyle. The Hockney work is definitely an intense one. It's a beautiful piece. The colors are just wonderful, and it just creates an environment that is his expression, the expression of the sitter Joe. It's so engaging. It just makes you want to know more about him and kind of learn more about his story. Are there any other comments or questions? Okay, well, I hope to see you in the museum very soon. The exhibition will be up until the 29th of August. And check our social media for our next event, which will be next Tuesday. Thank you so much and have a wonderful weekend. Bye.